Two of the most famous men in psychology spent years explaining why people behave irrationally. Then they destroyed their own friendship. Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung could interpret dreams, uncover buried desires, diagnose emotional defenses, and detect a childhood wound from approximately 3 rooms away. But when it came to speaking honestly to each other, they behaved much like the rest of us, only with longer letters. Their relationship began with almost embarrassing enthusiasm. Freud believed he had found the man who would carry psychoanalysis into the future. Jung believed he had met the first thinker brave enough to explore the darker rooms of the human mind. For a while, they seemed perfectly matched. Then admiration became expectation. Expectation became control. Intellectual disagreement became personal betrayal. And two men devoted to understanding conflict became remarkably talented at creating it. So why did Freud and Jung become enemies? The easy answer is that they disagreed about psychology. The more interesting answer is that they disagreed about who Jung was allowed to become. In March 1907, Carl Jung arrived at Freud's home in Vienna. Jung was 31, ambitious, physically imposing, and already respected for his work at a psychiatric hospital in Switzerland. Freud was 50, controversial, intellectually isolated, and still trying to convince respectable medicine that the unconscious mind was not something he had invented after a particularly heavy dinner. They entered Freud's study and began talking. 13 hours later, they were still talking. Most first meetings begin to struggle after someone asks about the weather. Freud and Jung apparently skipped lunch, dinner, and every normal social boundary. The attraction was intellectual, but it was also personal. Jung had been studying Freud's ideas and defending them when doing so could damage a young psychiatrist's reputation. Freud, meanwhile, immediately saw something valuable in Jung. Jung was brilliant. He worked at an important institution. He came from outside Freud's small Viennese circle. Most importantly for the expansion of psychoanalysis, he was not Jewish. Freud worried that critics would dismiss psychoanalysis as a private movement created by a small group of Jewish doctors in Vienna. Jung could help it become international. But Freud did not merely want an ally, he wanted an heir. In Jung, Freud believed he had found the man who could inherit his movement, defend it from its enemies, and continue the work after Freud was gone. A flattering position, also a dangerous one, because the chosen son receives affection only while he remains recognizably the father's son. For the next several years, Freud and Jung exchanged letters, ideas, dreams, theories, compliments, anxieties, and occasional psychological evaluations of people who had probably not requested them. Freud treated Jung as his successor. Jung addressed Freud with intense respect. Together, they helped turn psychoanalysis from a strange Viennese experiment into an international movement. In 1909, they traveled to the United States to lecture at Clark University. Imagine being trapped on a ship with Freud and Jung. You mentioned that you dreamed about missing breakfast. Freud quietly suspects forbidden desire. Jung begins discussing an ancient solar myth. By lunch, your toast has become a symbol of spiritual rebirth. During the journey, the two men analyzed each other's dreams. This was probably inevitable. Asking Freud not to interpret a dream would have been like asking a chef not to notice food. But according to Jung's later account, one exchange left a lasting impression. Jung wanted Freud to reveal more personal information so they could understand one of Freud's dreams. Freud resisted because he worried that revealing too much might weaken his authority. To Jung, this moment exposed a problem. Freud wanted psychoanalysis to uncover every hidden motive, except perhaps the motives of the man in charge of psychoanalysis. Whether Jung remembered the incident perfectly is less important than what it came to represent for him. Freud was no longer simply a teacher. He was becoming an authority who expected to remain psychologically above the people around him. The friendship had acquired a hierarchy, and Jung was beginning to feel its weight. Freud believed sexuality played a foundational role in human psychology. He did not mean only conscious sexual behavior. He meant a broad force of desire beginning in childhood, becoming repressed, redirected, disguised, and transformed. To Freud, dreams, symptoms, anxieties, relationships, and even cultural achievements often carried traces of this libidinal energy. Jung agreed that sexuality mattered. He simply did not believe it explained nearly everything. For Jung, libido was a more general form of psychological energy. Human beings were not only pushed by repressed wishes from the past, they were also pulled toward meaning, development, integration, and a future version of themselves. Freud looked at a dream and often asked, "What forbidden desire is hiding here?" Jung increasingly asked, "What is the mind trying to become?" Freud looked backward toward childhood. Jung also looked forward toward transformation. Freud was interested in the private history of the individual. Jung became fascinated by myths, religions, symbols, ancient stories, and patterns appearing across different cultures. A snake in a dream might remind Freud of instinct and sexuality. Jung might connect it to renewal, danger, healing, death, rebirth, or an ancient symbol shared across civilizations. Neither man had chosen a theory designed for peaceful compromise. Freud feared that Jung was moving psychology away from science and into mysticism. Jung feared that Freud was turning one discovery into a universal answer. Freud thought Jung was making the theory vague. Jung thought Freud was making the human mind small. Their disagreement was never only about libido. It was also about loyalty. Freud had spent years being mocked, rejected, and professionally isolated. Psychoanalysis was not merely his theory. It was the thing he had fought to build while much of the medical establishment treated him as either dangerous or absurd. He became protective of it. Very protective. The kind of protective where a theoretical revision begins to look suspiciously like treason. Jung, meanwhile, did not want to spend his career managing Freud's intellectual estate. He wanted to explore ideas Freud considered risky: religion, mythology, spiritual experience, symbolism, and the possibility that the unconscious contained more than repressed personal memories. The more Jung developed his own views, the more Freud saw him moving away from psychoanalysis. The more Freud demanded theoretical loyalty, the more Jung saw Freud as dogmatic. And then they made the mistake that only highly trained psychologists could make with such sophistication. They began analyzing each other instead of listening to each other. Freud could interpret Jung's disagreement as resistance, ambition, or unresolved emotional conflict. Jung could interpret Freud's authority as insecurity, rigidity, or a father complex. Once every criticism becomes a symptom, conversation becomes impossible. You cannot disagree with the theory because your disagreement proves the theory. It is an extremely efficient system. It is less efficient for maintaining friendships. By 1912, Jung was openly moving beyond Freud's framework. His major work on symbols and libido challenged Freud's emphasis on sexuality and developed Jung's broader interpretation of the unconscious. For Jung, this was intellectual independence. For Freud, it looked like the man chosen to protect psychoanalysis was dismantling it from inside. Their letters became colder. Warm admiration gave way to accusation. Accusation gave way to psychological diagnosis. Each man believed the other was unable to recognize his own motives, which is a wonderfully complicated way of saying neither believed the other was listening. Their father and son language now became painfully appropriate. Freud expected loyalty. Jung wanted adulthood. Freud believed Jung had betrayed the movement that gave him influence. Jung believed Freud wanted disciples rather than independent thinkers. In early 1913, Freud proposed ending their private relationship. Jung accepted. There was no dramatic duel, no overturned table, no final confrontation in a thunderstorm. Only letters. Polite enough to be civilized, sharp enough to perform minor surgery. Jung later resigned from his leadership position in the international psychoanalytic movement. The separation was complete. The chosen successor had rejected the inheritance. The split hurt both men. Jung entered a period of intense psychological instability and creative exploration. He recorded dreams, visions, fantasies, and imagined conversations in the work that eventually became known as the Red Book. Instead of abandoning the strange territory Freud feared, Jung walked directly into it. From this period emerged the central ideas associated with analytical psychology: archetypes, the collective unconscious, the shadow, psychological types, and individuation. Freud continued developing psychoanalysis, refining his ideas about repression, narcissism, aggression, civilization, and the structure of the mind. Their separation did not leave one winner and one loser. It created two different psychological traditions. Freud gave us a language for repression, hidden desire, childhood conflict, and the uncomfortable possibility that we are not fully in control of ourselves. Jung gave us a language for symbols, inner division, myth, psychological growth, and the lifelong struggle to become a more complete person. Both systems have been criticized. Both contain ideas that remain disputed. Both changed how millions of people describe their inner lives. And perhaps neither system would have developed so clearly if Freud and Jung had remained politely united. Freud and Jung certainly became rivals. Their followers formed competing schools. Their theoretical disagreement grew into one of psychology's most famous divisions. But enemies is slightly too simple. Jung did not erase Freud from his story. Even after their relationship ended, he continued to recognize Freud's importance. Freud had opened the door to the unconscious. Jung simply refused to remain in Freud's room. That may be the real tragedy of their friendship. Freud correctly recognized Jung's potential. He saw that Jung could carry psychology somewhere new. But when Jung began doing exactly that, Freud could not accept the direction. And Jung needed Freud's recognition long after he had begun rejecting Freud's authority. They were not strangers who discovered they had nothing in common. They were close because they shared an enormous project. They separated because they imagined different destinations. There is something surprisingly hopeful in that. Some relationships do not end because they were meaningless. They end because they succeeded in changing the people inside them. Freud gave Jung a path into the unconscious. Jung showed Freud how far beyond psychoanalysis that path might travel. They could not complete the journey together. But without their friendship, and perhaps without their breakup, neither man would have become quite the thinker we remember. Two psychologists entered a study and talked for 13 hours. Years later, they could barely speak at all. Yet the conversation never truly ended. We are still having it.